The soft murmur of laughter echoed from the living room as I stepped inside, a bouquet of flowers in my hand, ready to surprise Linda. Still, something felt wrong. As I peeked through the glass door, my heart dropped. Linda was sitting alone, tears in her eyes, while my son, Nathan, and Tracy's parents laughed, toasting something I couldn't understand. The sound hit me like a punch. That's when it all clicked. Everything they had planned, the betrayal. I stepped into the room, flowers in hand. "What's going on?" They froze, and I knew in that moment everything had changed. "Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together." Rob Hayes pulled into his driveway a full day ahead of schedule. The business trip he'd been on for the past week had wrapped up quicker than expected, and despite his exhaustion, there was something else driving him. The thought of surprising Linda. A small gesture, something simple, but sincere. He reached into the passenger seat and grabbed the bouquet of flowers he'd picked up earlier, a vibrant mix of roses and lilies. It had been a long time since he'd done anything just for her like this. No occasion, no reason other than to remind her he was thinking of her. He walked up the porch steps slowly, adjusting the flowers in his hand, trying to imagine her reaction. She'd probably laugh, roll her eyes at his attempts to be sweet, but deep down, he knew she'd appreciate it. He hadn't been the type to give spontaneous gifts often, but she deserved more of them. As he stepped inside, the first thing that hit him was the sound, the soft murmur of voices, followed by a burst of laughter, a full, hearty laugh that he hadn't heard in days, not since he'd left. He froze at the threshold of the living room, the flowers still clutched tightly in his hand. The laughter was coming from inside the house, his family. But something wasn't right. There was a tension hanging in the air, something that made his chest tighten. He didn't want to believe it, but something in his gut told him he should take a step back. Slowly, he leaned toward the glass door, just enough to peek through. And there she was, Linda, sitting on the couch, her face buried in her hands. She was crying, not sobbing, but quietly, painfully. Her shoulders trembled with every silent breath. His heart sank into his stomach. Around her, Nathan, his son, was laughing. Tracy, Nathan's wife, was smiling brightly, a glass of wine in her hand. Frank and Carol Denton, Tracy's parents, were seated next to them, enjoying themselves, their laughter ringing out like they were celebrating something at Linda's expense. Rob's eyes moved from Linda to the group, his mind racing with questions he didn't have answers for. He didn't speak. He didn't move. He just stood there, watching. And then Tracy spoke, her voice cutting through the tension, laced with a sharpness Rob had never heard before. "You two can finally relax when we move in," she said, her words light, but with an edge. Rob's grip on the flowers tightened, his knuckles white. He wanted to step forward, to confront them, but the words caught in his throat. He was frozen. His heart had turned cold in an instant. His breath, shallow and quick, seemed to echo in the stillness of the room. Linda's shoulders shook as she tried to compose herself, but it was clear she was broken, and that realization hit him like a punch to the gut. His smile, the one he'd worn so proudly just moments ago, faded. It felt as though the room around him had suddenly gone silent, the laughter still ringing in his ears, but now twisted, like a mocking echo. Nathan hadn't even looked at him. He was too caught up in the moment, basking in whatever victory they'd won. Rob wanted to shout, to demand answers, but something in the pit of his stomach told him this wasn't just a careless moment. This was something deeper, and then the words came, almost as if on their own. He muttered to himself, though his voice was low and steady, carrying the weight of a truth he could no longer ignore. "Dinner smells like betrayal." He didn't know why he said it, but the words felt true. He could feel the distance between himself and his son growing, stretching further than he ever imagined. His wife, the woman he'd loved for 35 years, sat in the middle of it all, caught between her son's arrogance and her husband's disbelief. She didn't deserve this. None of them did. The laughter didn't stop, but to Rob, it no longer felt like celebration. It was a taunt, a mockery of everything he had built, everything he thought he had protected. He turned away from the glass door, his mind already racing, already preparing for what would come next. But as he stood there, flowers still in his hand, the weight of what he had just seen settled in. He was no longer just disappointed. He was furious. A slow, burning rage was beginning to simmer inside him, the kind he hadn't felt in years. This wasn't a small misunderstanding. No, this was something else, something more dangerous. With a deep breath, he walked into the house, the flowers still clutched in his hand. He would not let this go unanswered, not this time. The laughter that had once sounded so warm now felt like a challenge, and Rob Hayes wasn't the type of man who backed down from a challenge, not when it came to his family. As he entered the room, his presence instantly shifted the energy. The laughter faltered. Eyes turned to him. The smile that had been on Tracy's face faltered, replaced by something more calculating, more guarded. Nathan stiffened. Linda, her face still flushed from crying, looked up at him with a mixture of relief and fear. It was in that moment, with everything hanging in the air, that Rob realized one thing. Whatever had been building up to this point, Rob Hayes stepped inside the door, the warmth of the house, greeting him like a strange comfort. His eyes didn't immediately fall on Linda, though he could feel her presence in the room. Instead, they scanned the faces around the table. Nathan was there, his posture rigid as always, sitting across from Tracy, who was forcing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Frank and Carol Denton, Tracy's parents, were perched on either side, their glassy, self-assured expressions almost matching the sleekness of their clothes. A far cry from the familiarity of home that Rob had expected to return to. He exhaled, keeping his movements deliberate, controlled. He set the flowers down gently on the kitchen counter, an unnecessary gesture considering the tension in the room, but it felt like the right thing to do. He needed to remind himself of normalcy, even as his gut twisted in disbelief. "Hello, everyone," he said, his voice steady but laced with an edge of something unspoken. He was calm, too calm, but it was a thin veneer, a mask that would crack at the slightest pressure. The laughter that had filled the room moments before seemed to evaporate as soon as Rob spoke. A heavy silence settled in. Linda's eyes, swollen and red, were fixed on the table. She didn't look up immediately. Her hands, pale and trembling, rested in her lap, as though she couldn't summon the strength to engage with anyone. Rob's gaze flicked to her, then back to Nathan, the son he had raised. His chest tightened. Nathan's usual air of superiority had faltered. His back was stiff, his face a perfect mask of indifference, too practiced, too forced. Rob noticed the slight shift of Tracy's smile, a movement so subtle it might have been missed by someone less observant. But Rob wasn't looking for what was said. He was looking for what wasn't. Frank Denton cleared his throat, his voice the same smug drawl Rob had grown so accustomed to over the years. "We didn't expect you back so soon," he remarked, his eyes glinting with a calculated amusement, as though the surprise of Rob's early return was some trivial inconvenience. Rob didn't respond immediately. His eyes locked onto Frank's, steady, unblinking, before he turned his attention back to Linda. There was something about the way she sat there, so small, so fragile, that made something dark stir inside him. She hadn't spoken, not a word. That wasn't like her. "What's wrong?" Rob asked softly, the question hanging in the air. He could feel the weight of the words before they even left his lips. He could already hear the half-truths, the awkward silence that would follow. Linda wouldn't want to say it. He knew that much, but it was time to hear it. Linda didn't answer. She simply shook her head, her breath hitching as she looked away from him. Her eyes welled up again, but no tears came. Rob's heart clenched. The woman he had spent his life with, his partner, his equal, had been reduced to this quiet, hollow version of herself. The realization stung more than he expected. "Linda," he murmured, his voice cracking ever so slightly as he took a step closer. The anger he had felt moments before faltered, replaced by something else, something raw. But he knew he couldn't let his emotions get the best of him. Not yet. He needed answers, not a breakdown. Still, she remained silent, her gaze falling to the flowers he had brought. The words caught in his throat for a moment, his frustration rising. His hand clenched into a fist, but he released it quickly. He didn't want to explode, not in front of them, not in front of her. Dinner sat untouched on the table, a cold mockery of what should have been a warm family meal. The air in the room thickened, suffocating, as Rob's mind raced. There was something deeper here, something more than just a bad moment. This wasn't about flowers or surprise visits or a misplaced joke. This was something ugly, something calculated. His gaze swept over the table again, but it was Nathan who caught his eye this time. His son's jaw tightened, his eyes flicking nervously toward Rob before quickly darting away. Rob could feel the weight of those eyes, the guilt, the shame. No, the arrogance that he had always seen in Nathan. That arrogance now seemed to weigh him down, like a mask too heavy to bear. Without thinking, Rob muttered the words under his breath. His voice was a low murmur, barely audible. "Dinner smells like betrayal." The words were simple, but they felt like a truth too heavy to hold back. His eyes didn't leave Nathan's face as he spoke, his gaze unrelenting. The words hung in the air, slicing through the silence. For a brief moment, Rob thought he saw something in Nathan's eyes, an imperceptible flicker of something like guilt, but it was gone as quickly as it had come. Nathan didn't respond. He didn't need to. The damage had already been done. Tracy shifted in her seat, her smile faltering for just a second before it returned, forced and brittle. Frank, too, seemed to stiffen, but he kept his expression neutral. Rob could feel the tension, the strain. He knew that neither of them would admit what was happening. Not here, not now. They'd bury it, twist it into something else. But he wasn't going to let that happen. Rob's hand moved to the back of the chair, his fingers brushing against the cool wood. He could feel the weight of the moment. The betrayal wasn't just in what they had done to Linda. It was in everything, every lie, every manipulation, every moment of silence that had piled up over the years, leading to this. His heart thundered in his chest, but his voice remained steady, controlled. "I need to understand what's going on here," he said, but it wasn't a question. It was a challenge, a warning. Nathan stiffened even more, his eyes flicking toward the door. Rob noticed. He was waiting for Rob to do something, anything, to break the tension. But Rob wasn't moving. Not yet. Not until he had the truth. The room was thick with unspoken words, with guilt that clung to the walls like a bad smell. And in that moment, Rob knew one thing for sure. The silence wasn't going to last much longer, not with him in the room. And so, he waited. The silence in the room was suffocating. Rob could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on his chest, his heart pounding with every second that passed. He'd expected a fight. He'd expected anger, maybe even fear, but not this. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was something else entirely. Nathan shifted in his seat, his fingers tapping against the edge of his glass. It was the only sound in the room, the soft rhythm of his anxiety. Rob could see it now, the way his son was trying to mask his discomfort with a false air of confidence. He knew what was coming. He had known it the moment he walked into this room, but hearing it out loud was another thing entirely. "We've been talking about a better future plan for the house," Nathan said, his voice steady but laced with an uncomfortable edge. He glanced around the room, as if searching for approval. Tracy nodded from across the table, her eyes gleaming with a cold satisfaction. But Rob wasn't fooled. The smile on Tracy's face was like a mask, carefully constructed, hiding something darker underneath. Rob's mind spun as he processed Nathan's words. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected his own son to be so calculating, so cold. A better future plan? For the house? His house? The place where he had spent nearly every day of his adult life, building memories with Linda, raising their children, making it a home? "What do you mean? A better future plan?" Rob's voice was controlled, though every word felt like it was being torn from him. He couldn't quite understand how they had gotten to this point. How had his own son come to believe that a plan like this was even possible? Tracy leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with a sharpness that made Rob's skin crawl. "Well, your parents could downsize," she said, her voice too smooth, too rehearsed. "This place is too much for them. It's too big for two people to manage. Rob blinked, her words hitting him like a physical blow. Too much for them? He had worked his entire life to make sure Linda and he were comfortable, to make sure they didn't need anything. The house was their sanctuary, a symbol of everything they had achieved. And now, here they were, being told that it was a burden. His gaze shifted to Linda. She hadn't said a word, but Rob could see the way her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. He could hear the soft tremor in her breath, and his stomach twisted in response. This was more than just a business transaction for Nathan and Tracy. This was about something deeper, something that didn't involve respect, love, or family. It's too much for them, Tracy continued, almost as if she were explaining something obvious. We'd take over the property. We'd keep it in the family, renovate it, make it work. It's a win-win. A win-win. The words echoed in Rob's head, their false ring cutting through the tension in the room. A win-win for who, exactly? He felt a rush of anger, fury, swell inside him. How had it come to this? How had his own flesh and blood reduced his home to an investment opportunity? The air felt thick, suffocating. Rob's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he kept his voice level, as if trying to hold on to whatever semblance of control he had left. "And you've already decided this, have you?" he asked, the words barely above a whisper. Linda's voice was soft, almost drowned by the silence in the room. They said it was already agreed. Rob's stomach turned at the sound of her words. Agreed? Who agreed to this? Who had made these decisions without consulting him, without consulting her? He turned slowly to Nathan, the realization settling in like a cold weight. Nathan, his own son, the one he had raised, the one who had always seemed so determined, so self-assured, was the one behind all of this. It was him. Nathan had orchestrated this entire thing behind their backs without even giving them a chance to voice their concerns, without even telling them what was happening until it was too late. Rob's breath quickened as he looked at Nathan, a surge of disbelief rising in his chest. "By who?" he asked, his voice barely more than a whisper, but the question rang through the room like a thunderclap. Nathan's eyes flicked nervously toward the floor before meeting Rob's gaze again. There was no apology in his eyes, no remorse, just cold calculation. "By me," he said simply, his tone devoid of any emotion. It was like a punch to the gut. Rob felt his world shift beneath him. It wasn't just that Nathan had made this decision, it was that he had done it so casually, as if the family home, his family's legacy, was something to be handed over, without even a second thought. Rob's chest tightened. His mind raced, struggling to process what he had just heard. His son, the man he had always trusted, had not only betrayed him, but had done it in front of Linda, in front of everyone. He could feel the anger rising, a cold fury creeping up his spine. This wasn't just about the house. This was about trust. This was about everything he had believed in, shattered in an instant. Nathan didn't look remorseful. He didn't even seem to understand the weight of what he had just confessed. He simply sat there, waiting for Rob to say something, to do something. But Rob wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't sure what to do. He had spent his whole life protecting his family, building a future for them, and now his son was taking it all away. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to calm down, but the words that came out next were cold, hard. "You've made your decision, then." Nathan's eyes flashed, and for a moment, Rob thought he saw a flicker of doubt, just for a second. But it was gone before it could settle in. Rob stood there for a long moment, the weight of his son's words crashing down on him. Everything he had known was slipping away, and he didn't know how to stop it. As he turned to leave, he felt the room close in around him, the air growing thick with unsaid things, unresolved tensions. The silence hung heavily in the air, suffocating, and Rob knew, with every step he took, that nothing would ever be the same again. The tension in the air was thick, palpable, almost suffocating. Rob sat down at the head of the dinner table, his movements deliberate and slow, the weight of what had just been said still pressing down on his chest. He could feel their eyes on him, Nathan, Tracy, even Frank and Carol, waiting for him to say something, anything. But Rob didn't speak. He just sat there, the sharp clink of the chair legs scraping against the wooden floor echoing in the room like a final warning. The table was set for dinner, but the food sat untouched, cold. No one seemed hungry now. Frank Denton cleared his throat, the sound jarring in the silence. He glanced at everyone, then back at Rob, his face attempting an expression of calm. "Well," Frank began, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "This is an interesting situation, but there's always a way forward. These things happen. A little restructuring, some changes, just part of making smart investments, right?" Rob's eyes narrowed. Investment. That word, the way Frank said it, like it was the simplest thing in the world, the way he dismissed what was happening in front of them as just another deal. Rob didn't need to hear it again. He wasn't here for more excuses or platitudes. He nodded once, curtly, his lips pressing into a thin line. He murmured. Investments. He wanted to say more, but he stopped himself. There was no point. What could he say? What would change? Frank wasn't interested in apologies, and neither was he. This wasn't about money or restructuring anymore. This was personal. Rob's eyes flicked across the table to Linda, who sat next to him. Her hands were clasped tightly together, her knuckles white, her eyes barely meeting his. She knew him better than anyone else, knew that when he was silent, it meant something. It was his silence that had always been his greatest weapon, and right now, it was brewing like a storm waiting to break. Linda's eyes were wide, filled with anxiety, but she didn't speak. She couldn't. She was trying to read him, trying to figure out what he was thinking. And Rob, he was thinking everything, but saying nothing. He raised his glass slowly, the crystal catching the dim light of the chandelier overhead. "To family," he said, his voice cool and steady, "and the lessons they teach us." It wasn't a toast. It wasn't celebratory. It was a challenge, a warning wrapped in words, a lesson that had yet to be learned. Everyone at the table froze for a moment, their glasses hovering just below their mouths as if they weren't sure how to respond. Frank's smile faltered, just for a moment, before it returned, tight and forced. Carol's lips pressed together in a thin line, her eyes narrowed, watching him closely. Tracy shifted in her seat, her fingers nervously tightening around the stem of her wineglass. Nathan, sitting across from Rob, didn't move at all, his face unreadable. Linda's eyes never left him as she raised her glass, her voice barely above a whisper. "To family," she repeated, her words soft but heavy with the weight of everything unspoken. Rob held her gaze for a long moment before he took a slow sip from his glass, the wine bitter on his tongue. The others followed, their movements stiff, hesitant, as if the very act of drinking might somehow break the fragile tension that clung to the room like smoke. The meal remained untouched. No one spoke again, and the silence stretched on, heavy and thick. The minutes passed, dragging like hours. Rob could feel the eyes of the others on him, waiting for him to break. But he didn't. He sat there, staring at his plate, his mind racing. There was nothing more to say. Not yet. But when the time came, they would all know. He wasn't finished with them. Not by a long shot. Later that night, after the last of them had left, Rob remained in the house, alone with his thoughts. The quiet was different now, colder somehow, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of the day's revelations. He walked slowly to his office, his footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. The familiar comfort of his home, once a sanctuary, now felt alien, as if it no longer belonged to him. He approached the safe in the corner of the room, the one he'd had for years. His fingers brushed the cold metal, and for a moment, he just stood there. The documents inside were more than just papers. They were his defense, his countermeasure, the proof he needed to take control of what was slipping away from him. The pieces were all there. He had to be careful, precise. He couldn't afford any mistakes. With steady hands, he dialed the combination, the numbers falling into place with a quiet click. The heavy door of the safe swung open, revealing the stack of papers within. Rob reached inside, pulling out a file, the contents hidden behind a thick folder. His eyes scanned the cover, the familiar legal jargon that meant nothing to anyone but him. but he knew what it meant. He let out a slow breath, his fingers running along the edges of the folder. This was the last move, the one that would make everything clear. This wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming what was his, what had been taken from him, little by little, piece by piece. But as he stood there, staring down at the file in his hands, something gnawed at him. A creeping doubt, a feeling that no matter how careful he was, no matter how much he had prepared, he wasn't the only one playing this game. And in that quiet, dimly lit office, Rob knew one thing for certain. Nothing was over. Not yet. Rob sat alone in his study, the evening light from the window fading slowly into dusk. The air in the room was thick, heavy with the weight of what he was about to uncover. He had taken the file from the safe earlier, holding it in his hands like it might shatter if he wasn't careful. The folder, thick with papers, felt like it carried the weight of his future, the future of his family. He had always believed that there was more to the story than what Nathan had told him, and now he was about to see the truth. He unfolded the documents one by one, his eyes scanning over the words, his mind piecing together what he had already suspected. The first few pages were just boilerplate language about refinancing. He didn't even blink. He'd seen those kinds of documents before, nothing too surprising. But as he moved further into the stack, his eyes caught something, a phrase, a clause, and then another. He stopped, his breath caught in his throat, his hand trembling slightly as he turned the page. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. There it was, in black and white. Documents that had been presented to Linda as simple refinancing papers, but they weren't. They were transfer documents, documents that gave Nathan joint ownership of the house. 2 months earlier, without Rob's knowledge, without even his consent, Nathan had manipulated Linda into signing away their family's future. Rob's blood ran cold as he read the signature line. Linda's name was there, clear as day, but the date, it was 2 months ago. It wasn't just a bad decision, it was a betrayal. His stomach churned. His son had pulled this off under their noses, under Linda's, under his. And for what? A simple promise of savings, a better future plan, as Nathan had so casually put it. His fists clenched. How had Nathan managed to do this, and how had Linda not seen it? How had they both been so blind? Rob's thoughts raced, the anger and betrayal rising up inside him, filling him with a bitter resolve. This wasn't just about a house. It was about trust, about everything that Nathan had torn apart. Across the room, Linda stood in the doorway, silent, watching him as he scanned the documents. She had been waiting for him to say something, for him to figure it out. She had known, at least on some level, that something was wrong. The silence between them had stretched on for days, both of them caught in the terrible knowledge that something had been stolen from them, and neither of them knew how to get it back. Rob looked up, meeting her eyes. He saw the pain in her face, the confusion. She was standing there, still as a statue, her hands shaking at her sides. Her face was pale, drained of color. Rob stood slowly, his chest tight, the file still clutched in his hand. He walked toward her, his heart pounding in his chest. When he reached her, he didn't know what to say at first. The words felt stuck in his throat. But then Linda's quiet sobs broke the silence. He said it was for lower insurance, she whispered, her voice cracking. He said it would be easier. I didn't know. Her eyes were filled with tears, and her face crumpled as she spoke, the weight of the truth crashing down on her. She had been manipulated, lied to, and in that moment, Rob could feel her breaking. Rob took a step closer, his arms moving to wrap around her. He held her tightly, feeling the tremors in her body as she cried. He didn't know how to make it better, not yet. But he knew one thing. He wasn't going to let this go, not for a second. It's okay, Rob murmured, his voice low and steady, though the anger burned in him. It's okay, Linda. He pulled her back slightly so he could look into her eyes. He thinks I'm old, he said, the words sharp now. Let's show him what old can do. Linda looked at him, her tear-streaked face a mixture of grief and something else, something darker. Her eyes flickered with doubt, but there was something else there too, a flicker of hope. Rob was giving her strength, even when he didn't have any left himself. "I'm not going to let him get away with this," Rob said quietly, his jaw tightening. "He's going to regret thinking he could just take what's ours." Linda nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Rob's heart ached seeing her like this. But at the same time, the fire inside him only grew hotter. This wasn't just about a house anymore. This was about family, about trust, about reclaiming what was theirs. Nathan had crossed a line, and Rob wasn't going to stand by while his son tore their family apart. Rob turned toward the phone, his mind already working. He needed to act fast. He picked it up and dialed the number he knew by heart, the number he had trusted for years, Gerald Blake, his longtime friend and lawyer. The phone rang once, twice, and then Gerald's voice came through the line, clear and calm as always. "Rob?" Gerald said, recognizing his voice immediately. "What's going on?" "I need you to meet me tomorrow morning," Rob said, his voice steady but filled with a cold determination. "We need to talk." There was a pause, a beat of hesitation. Then Gerald's voice was firm. "I'll be there. Whatever you need." Rob hung up the phone, his mind already racing with the next steps. But even as he made plans, a thought lingered in the back of his mind, a question he couldn't shake. How far would Nathan go to keep what he had taken? And how far would Rob go to get it back? As Rob turned back toward Linda, he saw the worry in her eyes, the fear of the unknown. But he could also see something else, something stronger, something more resolute. She wasn't giving up, and neither was he. Not yet. Not ever. The office was dim, the late morning light filtering through the blinds in narrow, angled slits. Rob sat across from Gerald Blake, his longtime friend and lawyer, waiting. He hadn't said much since he arrived, and Gerald hadn't needed him to. He already knew why Rob was here. The tension was thick between them, unsaid words hanging in the air like a cloud. Gerald opened the file slowly, his expression unreadable as he flipped through the pages, eyes scanning each one with a practiced precision. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the soft rustling of paper. Rob's hands were clenched on his knees, the anger simmering beneath his skin, ready to erupt. But he didn't speak, not yet. Finally, Gerald stopped. He laid the papers down on the desk, his eyes lifting to meet Rob's. "Well," he began, his voice quiet but steady, "I've seen enough." He paused for a moment, as if deciding how to phrase what came next. "Technically, it's legal, morally, rotten." Rob felt his stomach tighten. His pulse quickened, but he kept his voice level. "What do you mean, technically legal?" His mind was still reeling from the moment he first saw the documents, the ones Nathan had gotten Linda to sign. It wasn't a simple refinancing. No, it was a transfer of ownership. The moment he saw it, the truth crashed in on him. But hearing it from Gerald, a man he trusted, made it feel like a knife twisting in his gut. Gerald sighed, leaning back in his chair, his fingers tracing the edges of the paper. "What your son did isn't criminal," he said slowly, "but it's definitely a manipulation." He had Linda sign these documents under the guise of a simple refinancing. He didn't explain what they really were, papers that give him joint ownership. It's not illegal, but it's deceitful. The kind of thing that shouldn't be allowed, but it is. The words hung in the air, settling in like a weight that Rob could feel pressing against his chest. It wasn't criminal. That was the hardest pill to swallow. It wasn't something the law could just fix with a phone call or a quick legal maneuver. This wasn't just about a mistake. This was a betrayal, a quiet, calculated move that took advantage of Linda's trust, and by extension, his own. Rob's knuckles whitened as he gripped the edge of the chair. He stared at the papers, the injustice of it all gnawing at him. The house, the home that had been theirs for so many years, was slipping through his fingers, and the law seemed to be doing nothing about it. "Can we reverse it?" Rob asked, his voice low but edged with something raw, something desperate. He needed to know if there was a way out, some legal loophole that could undo what Nathan had done. Gerald didn't answer immediately. He looked at Rob for a long moment, his expression softening, but only just. "We can reverse it," he said finally, his voice low, almost resigned. "But it's going to take time. We'll need to build a case quietly, piece by piece. We can't go public yet. We need patience." Rob let out a breath, but it did nothing to release the tension in his chest. Patience. That word seemed so small in comparison to the magnitude of what was happening. The idea of waiting, of letting this go on longer, seemed impossible. His home, his family's legacy, was slipping away, and the thought of letting Nathan get away with it left a bitter taste in his mouth. "I'm not sure I have patience for this," Rob muttered, staring at the papers again, his hands gripping the edge of the desk. The anger was rising in him, threatening to break through the calm facade he'd been trying to maintain. It felt impossible to stay quiet, to let it unfold slowly. Gerald leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "You need to, if you want to win this, and you do, don't you?" He paused, giving Rob a look that spoke volumes. "You need to stay calm. You can't let them see you lose control. They'll dig their own hole, and when they do, we'll hand them the shovel." Rob sat back in his chair, his jaw tight. The idea of waiting, of playing a waiting game while Nathan thought he had already won, was grating. But Gerald was right. He knew he couldn't go in guns blazing. Not yet. He had to let Nathan think he had the upper hand, let him believe that the battle was over before it even started. But the anger in Rob's chest was fierce, a fire that burned hotter with every passing second. His son had stolen from him, had stolen from Linda, and that was something he could never forgive. "I'm going to make him regret this," Rob said quietly, almost to himself. "I'm going to make sure he knows exactly who he's messing with." Gerald's eyes narrowed slightly, and he nodded, a quiet understanding passing between them. "I know you will, but we do this right. We wait. When the time comes, we'll hit them where it hurts." Rob exhaled sharply, rubbing his hands over his face as if to wipe away the frustration, the helplessness that gnawed at him. "How long do we have?" he asked, his voice raw, full of the weight of his questions. Gerald shook his head slowly, his tone unreadable. "As long as we need, but be ready. Once we start, there's no turning back." Rob's gaze was steely, unwavering. He didn't need to hear anything else. He knew what needed to be done, and he was going to see it through, no matter what. He wasn't going to let Nathan have the last word, not in this fight. As he stood up, the weight of the decision hanging heavy on his shoulders, Rob's eyes lingered on the papers one last time. The next move was his, and he wasn't about to lose the one thing that mattered most. The next evening, the house felt different. Rob could almost taste the tension in the air. He had been calm all day, meticulously planning his next move, letting the anger simmer just below the surface. Tonight, he had a different kind of plan, a quiet kind, one that didn't involve rushing in with guns blazing, but rather letting Nathan and the Dentons think they had already won. He needed them to believe it. It was the only way to make this work. As he set the table for dinner, his hands moved methodically, placing the silverware just so, arranging the glasses with care. Linda moved around him in the kitchen, her movements slower than usual, still unsure of what to make of Rob's strategy. She hadn't said much since their conversation the night before, but Rob could see the flickers of doubt in her eyes. She didn't want this. She didn't want any of it. But Rob knew there was no turning back. He couldn't let Nathan win. Not like this. When the doorbell rang, Rob straightened, taking a deep breath. His hand hovered over the door handle, but before he could turn it, he glanced back at Linda, who stood silently at the counter, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Rob opened the door to find Nathan standing there, Tracy by his side, and Frank and Carol Denton close behind. Nathan's face was bright with excitement, his smile wide, practically glowing with the confidence of a man who thought he had already claimed victory. Rob could feel the tension in his own chest, the anger simmering just beneath his calm exterior, but he kept his voice even. "Evening," Rob said, his tone polite but flat, letting the words hang in the air for a moment. "Come on in. Let's talk about this move properly." Nathan beamed, stepping inside first, followed by Tracy, who shot Rob a smile that was too sharp to be genuine. The Dentons, as usual, trailed behind, their eyes scanning the room, evaluating everything, with a sense of superiority Rob had grown accustomed to. as they all settled around the table. Rob could see it in their eyes, the way they thought the game was already over. They thought they had won. Tracy was practically glowing, the wine glass in her hand sparkling under the light. Frank gave Rob a tight-lipped nod, the kind of nod that suggested he was already imagining how quickly the whole matter could be wrapped up. They were eager, too eager. Rob, however, sat back in his chair, calmly folding his hands in front of him, keeping his expression neutral. This was the moment he'd been preparing for, the one where patience and control would pay off. "So," Rob began, his voice steady, his gaze fixed on Nathan, "you want to take over the property, start making changes. I'm listening. I'm willing to agree to start the transition paperwork." Nathan's eyes lit up and he leaned forward, clearly pleased with how easily everything was falling into place. "I knew you'd see sense, Dad. It's just business, right? We're doing what's best for everyone." Tracy quickly added, "This is a smart move, Mr. Hayes. You'll see. Once everything's in motion, it'll all come together." Rob nodded slowly, not giving anything away. His mind was calculating, running through each possible outcome, anticipating every move. He wasn't about to rush into anything. He needed to make them feel like they were on the verge of getting what they wanted. He needed them to believe that they had already won. As he agreed to start the transition paperwork, he couldn't help but feel a small sense of satisfaction. They were so eager, so certain that they were getting what they'd worked for, but Rob knew better. He knew that nothing had been decided yet, not by a long shot. Across the table, Frank's eyes twinkled with approval. "We'll make sure to handle everything on our end," he said smoothly. "Get the appraisers in, the renovation started. It'll be perfect." Rob smiled faintly. "You'll think so too, until it's signed." His words were measured, quiet, but they hung in the air like a promise. He could see it in their eyes. They didn't understand yet. They didn't realize that they were still on his turf, that the game had just started. They had made their move, but Rob was ready to make his. Tracy's smile faltered for just a moment, the slightest crack in her facade, but she recovered quickly, taking a sip from her glass. "Of course," she said, her voice silky but with an edge. "We're just looking out for everyone." Rob didn't respond. He didn't need to. He was playing his part, letting them think they were in control. He needed them to walk into this trap, step by step. Gerald had made it clear that patience was key, and Rob had learned long ago that sometimes the most powerful move was to let others dig their own holes, and when they did, he would be waiting. As the conversation continued, Rob remained calm, offering little more than occasional nods and measured responses. He wanted them to keep talking, keep assuming that everything was going according to plan. He needed to let them get comfortable, let them think they had won. But as the dinner wore on, Rob's mind was elsewhere, on the next steps, on what would happen once they'd signed those papers, once they thought they had what they wanted. He couldn't let them get away with this, not like this. And as the evening came to a close, Rob stood up from the table, his eyes meeting Nathan's once more, his smile never reaching his eyes. "I'll let you know when it's time to sign," he said quietly. Nathan grinned, confident, still unaware of the trap that had been set. But Rob's mind was already moving ahead, already calculating what would come next. The trap was set, and this game wasn't over yet, not by a long shot. The phone call was brief, but it was enough. Rob sat at his desk, the dim light from his lamp casting long shadows across the room. He had spent the last few hours reviewing the mortgage documents, looking for a crack, a weakness in Nathan's carefully constructed plan. He had found it, a small clause, buried deep within the legal language, something no one had expected. His fingers hovered over the phone as he dialed the bank's number. The call connected, and Rob leaned back in his chair, trying to appear calm. His thoughts were a flurry of calculations, but on the surface, he needed to project nothing but control. The voice on the other end of the line was familiar, a bank officer he'd dealt with for years. "Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes," the officer said, a note of cordiality in his tone. "How can I assist you today?" "I need to restructure the mortgage," Rob said, his voice steady. "Under a holding company. I want to move the property to a new entity." "Certainly. I'll need to know which company you'd like to use for the transfer." Rob paused for a moment, a faint smile curling at the corners of his mouth. Hayes Heritage LLC, he said, the name rolling off his tongue with deliberate care. It was a name that sounded like legacy, like something established, something permanent. It was his. It always had been. But now, it was his safeguard, his leverage. The officer didn't hesitate. Got it. I'll prepare the documents. You'll have the new structure set up shortly. There was a brief pause as the officer continued typing on his end. That's a smart protection move, the bank officer added, seemingly impressed. Rob could hear the click of keys on the keyboard as the changes were made. Thanks, Rob said, his voice almost detached. It was done. He just altered the course of everything, subtly but decisively. Nathan would never know it was coming. He hung up, feeling the quiet satisfaction of the first piece of the puzzle falling into place. But it wasn't over yet. This was just the beginning. Across town, Nathan was hosting one of his usual gatherings. He was sitting in the living room of his house, what he called his house now, though Rob knew better. Nathan had invited a few friends over, likely to boast about his newfound inheritance, a topic that had consumed him since he thought he had won. Rob could picture the scene, Nathan puffing out his chest, telling anyone who would listen that he had finally secured the future, that the house was practically his now. He was bragging about inheriting early, as if it were something earned, something deserved. Rob could hear the conversation in his mind, Nathan probably speaking in that confident tone of his, telling everyone how he had outsmarted his parents, how he was taking control of the family legacy. Rob gripped the edge of his desk, the quiet rage building inside him, the nerve of him. He had no idea what was coming. Meanwhile, Linda was playing her part. Rob had seen it in her eyes the night before, how she was torn between supporting him and wanting to believe in Nathan's good intentions. Linda was trying to keep the peace, pretending to support Nathan, nodding along with his victories, hiding the pain of betrayal beneath a smile. Rob could see it now, how she would feign enthusiasm, applauding his success in front of their son, even as she quietly died inside. But Rob knew it was all part of the plan. He'd warned her. He had asked her to play along, to keep the facade intact for just a little while longer. The trap was set, and he needed them all to think they were winning, to think they were on the brink of getting everything they wanted. Rob leaned back in his chair, his mind focused. Every act of arrogance, he muttered to himself, the words bitter on his tongue, is free evidence. Every boast Nathan made, every claim of victory, was another thread in the rope that would tie him down. Rob didn't need to rush. Let Nathan parade his so-called triumphs to his friends. Let him puff himself up as much as he wanted. Every word, every action was another gift. He'd made sure of that. Rob glanced at the stack of documents on his desk, the ones he would use to turn this whole thing around. He had the leverage now. The holding company was just the beginning. It was a clever move, one that Nathan would never see coming. He couldn't. No one would expect it. Not until the documents were signed, until Rob pulled the rug out from under him. But as Rob sat there staring at the papers, the feeling of quiet satisfaction began to settle into something darker. How much longer could he play this game before it all came crashing down? How far would Nathan push before Rob had to take more drastic action? And as the hours passed, with Nathan celebrating his early inheritance, Rob couldn't shake the feeling that the trap was still tightening, slowly, steadily. But it wasn't time yet. Not until Nathan had everything he wanted. The doorbell rang a little after noon. Rob straightened, his fingers briefly touching the edges of the paperwork on his desk. He had known this moment was coming, but it still felt like a shift, a new chapter in this twisted game. Frank Denton had been all too eager to send an appraiser, no doubt looking to assess the value of the house for renovations or investments, but Rob had other plans. He took a deep breath, his eyes glancing at Linda, who was standing quietly in the kitchen. She didn't say anything, but the anxiety in her eyes was unmistakable. Rob knew she was as ready for this as he was. If things went as planned, this would be the moment when everything started to turn. Slowly, but unmistakably. With measured steps, Rob walked to the door. He opened it to find a man in his mid-50s, dressed in a suit that looked a little too new for someone in his line of work. He extended a hand. Good afternoon, the appraiser said with a professional smile. I'm Tom Hayes, here to inspect the property for Mr. Denton. Rob shook his hand, offering a polite but curt smile in return. I'm Robert Hayes, he said, his tone just the right mix of cordiality and control. Please, come in. The man stepped inside, and Rob led him into the living room, letting him take in the surroundings. The house looked exactly as it always had, comfortable, lived in, full of history. Rob could practically feel the blood, sweat, and years that had gone into every corner of it. The appraiser glanced around, nodding appreciatively as he surveyed the space. Beautiful craftsmanship, Tom said, running his hand over the edge of the fireplace. Whoever built this had quite the eye for detail. Rob's chest tightened at the words. He had built it himself, piece by piece, putting his life into making this house a home. I did, Rob said quietly, a faint but firm pride in his voice. Built it myself. Took me a lot of years, but it was worth it. Tom didn't seem to notice the subtle weight behind Rob's words as he continued his inspection, moving from room to room. Rob followed him, maintaining a calm, almost casual demeanor, but his mind was racing. This wasn't just an appraisal. This was a small piece of a much bigger strategy. It was all part of the game, one Rob had been forced to play, one he had no choice but to win. The appraiser noted the high ceilings, the old hardwood floors that Rob had lovingly restored over the years. He admired the kitchen's design, remarking on the way everything had been updated while maintaining its vintage charm. Rob nodded along, letting Tom do his job, but all the while, his mind was focused on the next move. Everything seems in order, Tom said as they entered the final room, the master bedroom. He paused at the window, taking in the view. Great location, he added, scribbling down some notes. Rob hesitated for just a moment, then casually mentioned, Funny, isn't it? How ownership can change so easily. The appraiser looked up at him, puzzled, but Rob's tone had been so measured, so nonchalant, that Tom didn't question it. Ownership, he asked, more to fill the space than out of any real curiosity. Rob's lips quirked in a faint smile. Yes, my son-in-law Nathan had some plans. Thought he'd move in here, make it his own. But it looks like things are different now. The appraiser blinked as though he was trying to connect the dots. Different how? Rob's eyes met his briefly before he spoke again, his voice calm, but carrying an undertone of quiet warning. Oh, nothing to worry about. Just some changes in who owns what. The words hung in the air like a threat, though it was unclear to Tom exactly what Rob meant. Rob made sure to keep his expression neutral, but the message was there. Nothing was as it seemed. Not anymore. Not with Nathan. Not with Frank Denton. The appraiser nodded, perhaps feeling a little uneasy, but too professional to let it show. He finished his notes and packed up his things, thanking Rob for his time. Rob escorted him to the door, offering a polite but firm handshake. I'll expect your report, Rob said, his words a quiet command. I'll send it over by tomorrow, Tom replied, stepping out onto the porch. Thank you again, Mr. Hayes. As the door closed behind him, Rob stood there for a moment, his hand resting on the doorknob. The pieces were all falling into place. Nathan thought he had control, that this house would be his. But Rob was the one holding the cards now. He knew it, and soon everyone else would too. Later that afternoon, Tom the appraiser made his call to Frank Denton. The moment the phone rang, Frank's voice came through, sharp and eager. Did you get the numbers? What's the value? Tom hesitated, an unease creeping into his voice. Mr. Denton, the property's no longer in your son-in-law's name. There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Frank's voice cracked through the silence, incredulous. What do you mean it's not in his name? Tom's voice was low, hesitant. It's under a different entity. A holding company, I believe. Something called Hayes Heritage LLC. It's no longer part of Nathan's assets. Rob didn't hear the rest of the conversation, but he could imagine Frank's shock, the realization dawning on him that Nathan had lost the upper hand. As the phone call ended, The Dentons were left to process the truth that their son-in-law had been outplayed. And Rob, with a quiet sense of satisfaction, knew the first piece of his plan had worked. The trap had been set, and the Dentons were in deeper than they realized. Now, it was only a matter of time before they figured it out, and before Rob made his next move. The dinner table was set, untouched, just like the silence that had settled over the house in the hours leading up to this moment. Rob sat at the head, his hands folded in front of him, waiting. He knew this confrontation was coming. He had known it the moment he made the decision to play this game. The quiet that filled the room now was heavy with anticipation, a kind of calm before the storm. The doorbell rang. Rob stood without a word, his eyes briefly meeting Linda's. She didn't say anything. But he saw it in her face, the same thing he'd seen in her eyes every day since this whole thing began. The uncertainty, the grief. She hadn't wanted it to come to this, but there was no going back now. He opened the door to find Nathan standing there, his face a mixture of fury and disbelief, flanked by Tracy and her parents, Frank and Carol Denton. The tension in the air was so thick it felt suffocating. Nathan's jaw was clenched, his posture rigid, like a man who had been betrayed. His eyes flicked over Rob, then to Linda, then back to Rob, the accusation burning behind his gaze. "What did you do?" Nathan's voice was low, but laced with anger, a challenge wrapped in a question. He didn't wait for Rob to respond before stepping inside, Tracy and the Dentons following behind him like an entourage. They were here for answers, answers that Rob had no intention of giving easily. Rob didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply met Nathan's gaze, his eyes cold and unyielding. "I protected what's mine." Nathan's face reddened, his fists clenching at his sides. "You've ruined everything. This house, this was supposed to be mine. I did everything right." His voice cracked with frustration, the tone dripping with entitlement. Tracy stepped forward, her lips curling into a sneer. "You tricked us," she said, her voice sharp, laced with contempt. She looked at Rob like he was the one who had wronged them, the weight of her words designed to cut deep. Rob didn't react, not in the way she wanted. His expression remained calm, almost too calm. "No," he replied, his voice a quiet baritone that filled the room with its certainty. "You tried to trick your mother." Tracy's sneer faltered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. Frank, however, wasn't as controlled. He stepped forward, his face tight with fury, his voice rising in indignation. "This isn't how this was supposed to go, Rob. You've gone too far. You need to reverse it. Now." Rob didn't move, didn't flinch. He reached over to the pile of documents he had placed on the table earlier that evening. The notarized papers, his only weapon. Slowly, deliberately, he slid them across the table toward Frank. "This is the reversal," Rob said, his voice calm, almost too calm. "I did exactly what needed to be done." Frank's eyes locked onto the documents, then flicked up to Rob, disbelief clouding his features. "You can't just—" he began, but Rob cut him off. "I just did," Rob said, his tone carrying an edge that made the words hang in the air, heavy and final. "Game's over." There was a beat of silence. Rob could feel the shock radiating from Nathan, from Tracy, from the Dentons. The weight of what was happening was sinking in, slowly, painfully. Frank opened his mouth to argue again, but Rob stood up, pushing his chair back with a soft scrape. "We're done here," Rob said. His voice was unwavering, leaving no room for negotiation. "I've already made my move. Now, you deal with the consequences." Rob turned and walked away from the table, the sound of his footsteps echoing in the silence of the room. He didn't look back as he made his way down the hallway. Behind him, he could hear Frank's angry mutterings, Tracy's sharp, frustrated breaths, but none of it mattered anymore. The game was over. For a moment, Rob thought about what this would mean for Linda, the house, the life they had built. He had won this battle, but at what cost? He didn't know. All he knew was that he had protected what was his. He had done what needed to be done. As he reached his office, Rob paused, his hand on the door frame. He didn't turn around. He didn't have to. He could feel them there in the living room, trying to figure out how they had lost control. how they had miscalculated. But Rob knew the truth. The storm wasn't over. This was just the beginning. And in the silence of his office, with the weight of the confrontation hanging in the air, Rob knew one thing for certain. He wasn't finished yet. It started with a whisper, an anonymous tip to the local news outlet, a small piece of information tucked inside a larger story. But the next morning, the headline was splashed across every local paper and website. Elder couple nearly conned by own son. Rob's eyes scanned the words, his stomach turning with each line. The details weren't all correct, but they were close enough. And in the end, that's all it took. The headline alone told the story. Nathan had been caught, his betrayal exposed to the world, painted in the kind of light Rob knew would leave a permanent stain. Linda walked into the room just as he was reading the article aloud, her face pale, her hands trembling slightly. She had seen the report too, of course. Everyone had. The damage was done. "They're saying we almost got conned," she whispered, almost as if she couldn't believe it. "It's everywhere. The whole neighborhood's talking about it." Rob set the newspaper down carefully, his jaw tight. He could already feel the eyes of their neighbors on him. Their sympathy was thinly veiled, like a bandage over a wound that would never heal. The whispers would start, the pitying looks, the side glances that made him want to crawl into a hole and never come out. He had spent his whole life building his reputation, his family's legacy, and now it felt like it was all being torn down in an instant. But he couldn't let that show. Not now. Not in front of Linda. "They'll forget about it eventually," Rob said, his voice calm, but there was an edge to it. "We'll move on." But Linda wasn't so sure. "Will they?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Will they ever forget? How can we? How can we ever go back to the way things were?" Rob didn't have an answer for that. He didn't know if they could ever go back to normal, but he knew one thing for sure. Nathan had made a mistake. A mistake that would cost him everything. Rob would make sure of it. Across town, Nathan was spiraling. He had seen the report too, and the fury inside him was unlike anything he'd felt before. It wasn't just the betrayal that stung. It was the humiliation. His name was out there, dragged through the mud, framed as the villain in a story he hadn't even meant to play a part in. But it was too late now. The damage was done, and Nathan had nowhere to turn. He stormed into his in-laws' house, rage simmering behind his eyes. Frank Denton was seated in his favorite chair, flipping through a stack of financial reports, while Carol sat nearby, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Do you see this?" Nathan barked, throwing his phone onto the coffee table, the headline flashing on the screen. "Do you see what's happening to me?" Frank didn't look up. "We told you this would happen," he said, his voice dripping with annoyance. "This is what comes of trying to take shortcuts, Nathan." "This is your fault," Nathan shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. "You told me to move fast. You encouraged me to push things through with the house." His chest heaved with anger, but Frank remained stoic, his face unreadable. "Nathan," Carol said softly, her voice tight with reproach. "We've had enough of this. Your mistake was your own. Don't blame us for your failures." Nathan's eyes burned with rage, but it was the words from her father that truly cut deep. "You embarrassed us publicly," Frank said, his tone final, cutting through the air like a blade. "The last thing we need is this mess on our hands." Nathan recoiled as if he'd been slapped, but Frank didn't care. He was done. "We're done," Frank continued, standing up with a cold finality. "Your mother and I are cutting you off. No more financial support. You'll figure it out on your own now." The words hit Nathan like a wave, knocking him back. The weight of the betrayal from the Dentons, from the very people he had relied on, was too much. He had thought they were his allies, his partners in this scheme, but they were nothing more than fair-weather friends, ready to abandon him at the first sign of trouble. The house, the life he had envisioned, was slipping further from his grasp. His reputation, his future, gone in an instant. And it was his own fault. Panic began to claw at him. He needed help. He needed someone to fix this. Nathan picked up his phone with shaking hands. The only person he could think of, the only person, was Rob, the man he had betrayed. He didn't care. He was desperate. He dialed Rob's number, his mind racing with the words he would say. Rob answered after the second ring, his voice cool. "What do you want, Nathan?" Nathan's voice faltered, the anger mixing with something more raw, more fearful. "I need help. You have to help me, Dad. This can't be how it ends. I didn't mean for this to happen." Rob's response was sharp, final. "You called the wrong man, son." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, Nathan's breath ragged as he processed Rob's words. The coldness, the finality of it, left him speechless. "You'll have to face the consequences of your actions," Rob continued, his tone unwavering. "You're on your own now." Nathan's panic deepened, but Rob had already made up his mind. The line clicked dead, and the silence that followed was suffocating. Rob put the phone down, his gaze fixed on the wall ahead. He could feel a strange mix of satisfaction and sorrow. This was it, the point of no return. Nathan had chosen his path, and now he would walk it alone. The morning light streamed through the windows, casting long shadows on the hardwood floor. Rob stood at the kitchen counter, sipping his coffee, the sound of the ticking clock filling the silence. It was almost surreal, the calm before the storm. He had waited for this moment, planned for it, and now the day had arrived. Today, Nathan and Tracy would have to face the consequences of their actions. Rob's mind was a quiet storm, each thought sharp and deliberate, each move calculated. The documents were ready, the legal clause was in place. All that was left was to enforce it. He had spent years working for this home, building it with his own hands, shaping it into a sanctuary. And now Nathan, his own son, had tried to tear it apart, tried to take it all away. The doorbell rang, cutting through the quiet. Rob's heart beat steadily, his nerves under control. He wasn't going to let this moment slip away. He walked calmly to the door and opened it without hesitation. Nathan stood there, his face flushed with anger, Tracy beside him, her expression one of defiance. The air between them was thick with tension. Behind them, a moving van sat in the driveway, ready for its contents to be loaded up. They had come to collect their things. Nathan spoke first, his voice sharp. "This is ridiculous, Dad. You can't do this. We've been living here for years. This house, this is our home now." Rob didn't flinch. He had expected the protest, expected the outrage, but he had made up his mind. "It's not yours, Nathan," he said calmly. "Not anymore." Tracy stepped forward, her face twisted in frustration. "This is just petty revenge, Rob. You think you're winning, but you're not. You're just destroying your family." Her words dripped with venom, but Rob didn't let them land. He had heard it all before. The manipulations, the guilt trips. He wasn't buying it anymore. "This isn't about revenge," Rob said quietly, his voice steady. "It's about justice. You and Tracy have both crossed a line, and now you have to face the consequences. According to the clause in the deed." Rob pulled out the legal document from his pocket and held it up for them to see. "Any cohabitant involved in fraud must vacate the property." There was a moment of stunned silence. Nathan's mouth opened and closed as he tried to process what Rob had just said, his eyes widening in disbelief. Tracy stood there, her jaw clenched, her fingers twitching at her sides as if she were preparing to lash out. "You can't just," Nathan began, but Rob held up his hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "I already have," Rob said simply. "This is done. You've been given your notice. You have to leave." Tracy's eyes narrowed, and her lips curled into a sneer. "You'll regret this, Rob," she hissed, her voice low and threatening. "You have no idea what you're doing. This will come back on you." Rob's gaze didn't waver. "I already did," he replied, his voice calm, almost too calm. "That's why I fixed it." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of the past few weeks. Rob had already regretted the path they were on, regretted how it had come to this. But he had made his choice. He had protected his family, protected Linda. This was the only way forward. He wasn't going to let Nathan and Tracy destroy everything they had built. Nathan stood there for a moment longer, his fists clenched by his sides, his anger palpable. But there was something else there now, something deeper than just fury. There was fear, too. The realization was sinking in. He had lost. "We don't need to do this, Rob," Nathan muttered, his voice shaking just a little. "This doesn't have to end like this." But Rob's resolve was unshakable. "It already has, Nathan," he said quietly. "It's over." With that, Rob turned and walked away, leaving them standing there in the doorway. The house, their house, was no longer theirs. Nathan and Tracy would have to pack up and leave, just as the legal papers had stated. Rob knew it wasn't going to be easy. He knew it would hurt, especially for Linda, but it had to be done. Inside the house, Rob found Linda quietly packing up their things, moving slowly from room to room, sorting through belongings with the precision of someone who had already given up on what was lost. She didn't speak at first, just focused on folding clothes, carefully placing them into boxes, her face a mask of quiet pain. Rob stood in the doorway watching her, his heart heavy. He had done what he needed to do, but it hadn't made the hurt go away. Not for her, not for him. Linda finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It hurts," she said, her shoulders slumping with the weight of it all. Rob walked over to her, his hand reaching out to touch her arm, the gesture gentle but firm. "I know," he said softly, "but this is justice. It's the only way to make it right." She looked up at him then, her eyes filled with a sadness he couldn't fix. But he didn't need to fix it. Not right now. All he needed to do was be there. As Rob turned to leave the room, he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He turned around to see Tracy standing at the doorway, her face still tight with anger, her eyes burning with resentment. "You'll regret this," she spat again, the words sharp and final. Rob didn't flinch. He simply nodded. "I already did," he repeated. "That's why I fixed it." And with that, he walked out of the room, leaving her behind, just as Nathan and Tracy would be leaving the house. The finality of it all settled in, but the fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The news spread quickly, faster than Nathan had anticipated. Word of his betrayal hit the streets, and the ripple effects were undeniable. The first to turn were the business contacts. The ones who had once applauded his ambition, his sharp instincts, now distanced themselves, their polite rejection emails arriving with unsettling regularity. Due to unforeseen circumstances, they all said, as though the past few months had been nothing but a misunderstanding. Nathan's company, once thriving, now seemed like a sinking ship, with clients and investors pulling out one after another. He watched helplessly as his career, built on years of carefully curated relationships and schemes, began to unravel. His phone buzzed constantly with calls from creditors, each one more insistent than the last. His reputation had tanked. He couldn't even deny it anymore. The whispers behind closed doors, the sideways glances when he walked into a room, all pointed to the same truth. Nathan Hayes had lost everything. He had tried to secure his future through deceit, but all he had done was create a path to his own destruction. And then, the final blow. Tracy. She had kept her composure for as long as she could, but eventually, the anger that had festered beneath the surface boiled over. She filed for divorce, citing financial betrayal as the reason. The irony wasn't lost on Nathan. The woman who had once stood by his side through all his schemes was now using his own words against him. The papers arrived in the mail, each one a reminder that everything he thought he had, everything he believed was secure, was slipping away. Tracy didn't just leave him emotionally. She made sure he felt the weight of it all, practically, legally, financially. As if the divorce wasn't enough, she also made it clear to everyone that she was taking as much as she could. The house, the assets, the reputation he had worked so hard to build. Nathan sat in his office, staring at the divorce papers in front of him, his hand shaking as he picked them up. The walls of his once pristine office seemed to close in around him. He had always thought that power, money, and manipulation would keep him safe. But it hadn't worked. None of it had worked. His life had been built on lies, and now all he had left were the ruins. He looked at his phone, willing it to ring, to get just one call that might pull him out of this mess. But the screen remained silent. the name of every caller either unfamiliar or unwanted. It was over. The world that had once revolved around him now felt like it was collapsing in slow motion. Meanwhile, Rob had been watching it all unfold with a quiet resolve. His plan had worked. Nathan had been exposed, and now there was no turning back. But Rob wasn't done yet. He couldn't be. Later that day, Rob met with Gerald, his old friend and lawyer. Gerald's office smelled of wood and aged paper, a quiet place filled with years of experience and calm judgment. Rob sat across from him, his face unreadable. "I assume you've seen the news," Gerald said, leaning back in his chair, his fingers tapping thoughtfully on the desk. "Nathan's reputation is in free fall. His business contacts are pulling back. And now Tracy's gone public with the divorce. She's made sure the world knows exactly why." Rob didn't respond right away. He hadn't wanted this for Nathan, but he knew it had to happen. It was the only way to make things right. He didn't just want to win the battle. He wanted Nathan to understand the consequences of his actions. "He's learning the hard way," Gerald continued, watching Rob closely. "The lesson's been taught. It's over." Rob's gaze darkened. "Not yet," he said firmly, his voice low. He wasn't ready to let Nathan off the hook, not when there was one more thing to be done, the final piece of the puzzle. Rob stood up and walked to the desk, pulling out a letter from his briefcase. The final notice, the one that would sever any remaining ties Nathan had to the Hayes legacy. "You're doing this?" Gerald asked, his voice cautious. "You're taking his name off?" Rob nodded. He needs to understand what family means, once he loses the word. He slid the letter across the table, and Gerald hesitated before picking it up. There was a brief silence as Gerald read through the contents of the letter, his expression unreadable. He sighed softly, placing the paper back down. "This will destroy him," he said quietly, though it wasn't judgment in his voice. Just a statement of fact. Rob met his eyes, unwavering. "Good." Gerald leaned back, his fingers steepling together. "You're sure?" "I've been sure for a long time," Rob said, his tone quiet but resolute. "This is about more than just him losing everything. It's about teaching him the value of integrity, about showing him what it means to earn the right to call this family his." Rob picked up the letter and sealed it with a finality that echoed in the room. The last tie had been severed. The name, the legacy, it was no longer Nathan's to claim. As Rob stood and walked out of Gerald's office, the weight of what he had done settled on his shoulders. This wasn't the end of the battle. It was only the beginning. Nathan would learn. He would understand. But for now, Rob had to let him feel the full force of the consequences. Nathan, alone and broken, was facing a future he had never prepared for. And Rob knew one thing. This was the moment of reckoning. It wasn't over yet. Nathan stood at the end of the driveway, his heart pounding, a tight knot forming in his chest. The house, his childhood home, loomed ahead of him, but it felt different now, somehow alien. He had been here countless times before, but today everything felt heavy, loaded with meaning. He hadn't spoken to his parents in weeks, not since everything had gone wrong, since the fallout had consumed his life. His steps were slow, deliberate, as if his body was already preparing itself for the confrontation he knew was coming. He didn't know why he had come. He didn't know what he expected to find, but he knew one thing. This was the last time he would stand here, in front of this house, trying to salvage whatever piece of dignity was left. As he reached the garden at the side of the house, he saw her, Linda, his mother, kneeling in the flower bed, her hands deep in the soil, her back turned to him. The sight hit him harder than he expected. She was always in the garden when he was a child, planting flowers, making everything bloom with her quiet care. He remembered watching her as a boy, wondering how she could make the world seem so peaceful and full of life. But today, it was different. Linda wasn't smiling. Her shoulders were hunched, her movements slow, methodical. As Nathan stepped closer, the soft sniffle broke the silence. He stopped, frozen in his tracks, his heart sinking into his stomach. She was crying. The sight of his mother like this twisted something deep inside him. The anger, the resentment, everything he'd felt in the past weeks seemed to fade, replaced by something raw, something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt, pain, regret. It was as if the world had suddenly flipped, and he saw things clearly for the first time. He had hurt her. Nathan took a tentative step forward, his voice barely a whisper. "Mom," he said, the words sounding strange on his lips. She didn't look up at first, continuing her work as if she hadn't heard him. He felt a surge of frustration, but he pushed it down. "I didn't mean to hurt you." Linda stopped what she was doing and finally turned, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Her face was pale, her features tight with sorrow, and for the first time in a long time, Nathan saw the weight of the years on her. It wasn't just the betrayal of the last few months. It was the years of silent sacrifice, the quiet exhaustion in her eyes. She had given him everything, and he had repaid her with lies. She said nothing for a long moment, just looked at him, her eyes filled with unspeakable pain. Then her voice came, small, barely a breath. "I know, Nathan. I know you didn't mean it, but it doesn't change what you did." She shook her head slowly, almost as if she were trying to convince herself of something. "It doesn't change what you did." Nathan's chest tightened. He wanted to explain, to make her understand, but the words didn't come. What could he say? That he had been selfish? That he had wanted more than he deserved? The truth was simple. He had wanted to win. And in the end, he had lost. Before he could speak, he heard the familiar sound of footsteps behind him. He turned, and there he was. Rob, standing in the doorway, his face set in its usual mask of calm, but with something darker in his eyes. Rob had always been the steady one, the man who held everything together, while Nathan had always been the one to break things. The air shifted in an instant. The weight of Rob's gaze was unrelenting, and Nathan could feel it pressing down on him, suffocating him with the gravity of everything he had done. Rob didn't say anything at first. He just stood there, his arms crossed, his eyes locked on Nathan with a kind of finality that Nathan couldn't escape. Nathan shifted uncomfortably, swallowing the lump in his throat. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice hoarse, almost pleading. "What do you expect me to say? That I'm sorry? That I didn't mean to ruin everything?" Rob took a slow, deliberate step forward. His face was unreadable, but Nathan could see the bitterness in his eyes, the quiet rage that had been building for months. "You didn't try to ruin everything, Nathan," Rob said, his voice low and measured, cutting through the air. "You tried to win. You wanted to take what wasn't yours, and in the process, you lost everything." Nathan's breath caught in his chest, his throat tightened, and for the first time he couldn't look Rob in the eye. It was as if the truth had finally sunk in, and it was unbearable. Rob's next words were quieter, but they hit Nathan like a punch to the gut. "You meant to win. You lost." Nathan opened his mouth, but no words came. He had nothing left to say, nothing left to defend himself with. Everything he had built had crumbled, and now, standing here in front of the people he had hurt most, he realized just how far he had fallen. Rob didn't wait for a response. He turned, his back to Nathan, and began to walk away. "I don't need anything from you," Rob called over his shoulder, his voice still steady but filled with something darker now. "You've already given me the lesson." Nathan stood there, frozen, watching Rob walk away, his heart heavy with a grief he hadn't expected. It was over. He was alone. And as he stood in the garden, the weight of the consequences finally crashing down on him, he realized the truth. The hardest part wasn't losing the house, or the business, or the money. It was losing his family. And as he turned to leave, the door to the life he had once known closing behind him, he didn't know what came next. He didn't know how to fix it, but he knew this. There was no going back. The house was still the same on the outside, tall, proud, standing as a testament to the years Rob had spent building it with his own hands. But inside, everything had changed. Every room felt emptier, more hollow. Rob had made the decision a week ago. He would sell the house, publicly. It would be the final act in a long, painful process. But it was necessary. Rob stood outside the front door, looking over the yard one last time. The lawn, neatly manicured, looked like it always had. The flowers Linda had planted, though a little worn with time, still bloomed. each petal a reminder of the life they had shared here, the life Nathan had tried to take from them. Linda stepped up beside him, her hand resting lightly on his arm. They hadn't talked much about the decision. She hadn't protested, hadn't begged him to reconsider, but Rob knew her better than anyone. He could see the grief in her eyes, the sorrow that lingered in her every movement. Selling the house meant letting go of the life they'd built together, the memories they'd made. But Rob knew it had to be done. He wasn't going to let Nathan or anyone else control what was rightfully his. The house had been their foundation for years. Now it was time to let go and give it to someone who could appreciate it the way it was meant to be. The day of the auction arrived. The crowd gathered in front of the house, a mix of curious neighbors and strangers, all eager to see what would happen. A few people whispered among themselves, casting curious glances toward Rob and Linda as they stood near the porch. The small suburban street, usually quiet, now felt like a stage, everyone waiting for the curtain to fall. Rob looked out over the crowd, his heart steady but his mind racing. He wasn't doing this for the money. He wasn't even doing it for the closure it would bring. He was doing it because this was the only way to truly take control back. This wasn't about revenge. This was about restoring balance. This was about proving that the house, this home, meant more than just bricks and mortar. The auctioneer called the crowd to order, raising his gavel, ready to start. Rob's gaze swept across the crowd again. It was strange. The energy in the air was thick with anticipation, but Rob couldn't shake the feeling that someone was missing. Then he saw him, Nathan. Standing at the edge of the crowd, his hands in his pockets, Nathan watched from a distance. His face was hard, his eyes narrow, but there was no mistaking the weight of regret in his posture. Nathan had come, but he hadn't come to bid. He had come to watch, to witness the finality of everything he'd lost. Rob felt a pang of something. Anger, perhaps. Or maybe pity, but he quickly pushed it aside. This wasn't about Nathan anymore. It was about Rob and Linda reclaiming their future, about stepping into the next chapter of their lives without the shadows of Nathan's betrayal hanging over them. The bidding began, the crowd responding to the auctioneer's calls, raising their hands in quick succession. Rob stood still, his focus fixed on the crowd, but his mind was far away, drifting through the memories of the years spent in this house. Linda stood beside him, her presence a steadying force. She wasn't saying anything, but Rob could feel her by his side, supporting him silently. As the price began to climb, Rob's thoughts were interrupted by a voice beside him. A reporter had approached, a camera crew following closely behind. "Mr. Hayes," the reporter asked, her voice light but probing. "Why donate the proceeds from the auction to charity instead of keeping it for yourself?" Rob turned to face her, his gaze steady, unflinching. The question wasn't unexpected. He had already decided how he would answer it, but the truth of it came out with a calm conviction that surprised even him. "Because legacy isn't walls," he said, his voice strong, "it's character." The reporter nodded, seemingly satisfied with the answer, and moved on, the camera capturing the moment. Rob glanced at Linda, who was standing a little taller now, her eyes filled with pride. He could see it in her face, the quiet satisfaction that came from knowing the right thing had been done, even when it hadn't been easy. The auction continued, but Rob's eyes kept returning to Nathan. He was still standing there, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. Rob couldn't help but wonder what Nathan was feeling, what thoughts were running through his head. Was he regretful? Did he understand now what he had lost? The bidding finally stopped. The house had sold. The gavel came down with a resounding thud, final and irrevocable. Rob stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of the decision settle in. This house, this chapter of their lives, was officially closed. As the crowd began to disperse, Nathan remained, lingering by the sidewalk, looking at the house one last time. Rob watched him for a moment, then turned to Linda. She had a soft smile on her face, the kind that Rob had seen 1,000 times. It was the smile of someone who had weathered the storm and had come out stronger on the other side. Rob took Linda's hand in his, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Let's go home," he said quietly. As they walked away from the auction, Rob couldn't help but look back at Nathan one last time. His son was still standing there, his head lowered, regret heavy in his stance. But it was too late for apologies. too late for second chances. Rob knew Nathan would never understand the full weight of what he had lost. How could he? But for Rob and Linda, this was a new beginning. They had closed that chapter finally, and whatever came next, they would face it together. But even as they walked away, the weight of that final moment lingered, an unanswered question hanging in the air. What would Nathan do next? The weeks had passed slowly since the auction, each day a quiet reminder of what had been lost. Rob spent his mornings at the office, his evenings in the quiet of the house. The decision to sell had been made, but the weight of it hadn't lifted. He and Linda had moved on, piece by piece, even if the pieces were still scattered in their minds, holding on to memories they weren't ready to let go of. Rob stood in the study staring at the envelope in front of him. It was simple, just a plain white envelope, no return address, but Rob knew exactly who it was for. He had thought about this moment for weeks, considered every possible outcome, every word he might say. But as he stood there, holding the letter in his hands, the decision felt heavier than he had imagined. Nathan had been quiet since the auction. Rob hadn't seen him or heard from him. He had heard the rumors, of course, that Nathan had lost his business, that he was struggling. But it wasn't his problem anymore. It couldn't be. Rob had made sure of that. But now, here he was, standing in front of the envelope, his fingers brushing over the paper. Nathan had tried to take everything from him. Rob had fought back, and in the end, he had won. But there was still one last thing, one final act, not of vengeance, but of closure. Rob picked up the pen, his hand steady as he signed the letter, adding one last note. He folded the deed, the copy of the house's title, carefully inside, and sealed it. The note read simply, "Earn the name back." He stared at the envelope for a long moment, the words burning in his mind. It was harsh, perhaps, but it was the only thing he could offer Nathan now. A chance. A final chance. Rob didn't know if Nathan would take it. He didn't know if Nathan was capable of understanding what it meant, but he had to give him that chance. He had to let him find his way back, if there was a way back at all. Rob dropped the letter in the mailbox the next morning. The weight of it, the finality of it, felt different now. It wasn't a letter of anger. It wasn't even a letter of forgiveness. It was something else, a possibility. A door, slightly ajar, with no guarantee that Nathan would walk through it. Rob had done what he needed to do. The rest was on Nathan now. The next few weeks were quiet. Rob didn't think about the letter much, but when he did, he wondered where Nathan was, what he was doing. He hadn't seen him in weeks, and Rob had stopped tracking his movements. It wasn't his place anymore. Whatever path Nathan chose, it was his to walk. Then, one afternoon, Rob received the news from Gerald. They were sitting together in Rob's study, the familiar scent of old books and leather filling the room, when Gerald looked up from his phone, a slow smile spreading across his face. "He's doing it, Rob," Gerald said, his voice calm, but with an undertone of something like approval. "Nathan's working construction. I heard he's trying to rebuild his life. Trying to earn some money the hard way." Rob sat back in his chair, absorbing the news. His first instinct was to feel something. Satisfaction? Disappointment? He wasn't sure. He had expected nothing less from Nathan, certainly not a life of privilege anymore. But this? It was different. It was hard. It wasn't what Rob had envisioned for him, but it was real. For the first time in a long time, it felt like Nathan was trying to make something for himself, something that wasn't handed to him. "He's following your path," Gerald added, his eyes scanning Rob's face for a reaction. Rob's gaze was distant, his mind turning over the words. "Then maybe there's hope," he said quietly. The words felt strange, not quite fitting in the space between them, but there was something in his tone, a flicker of something he hadn't felt in months. A sense of possibility. The idea that Nathan could change, could learn what it meant to work for something, to truly earn something. It felt like a distant dream, but Rob was willing to let it breathe. He wasn't sure what would come of it, but he was willing to wait to see how it played out. If Nathan had learned anything, he would prove it, one step at a time. That evening, when Rob came home, Linda was sitting at the dining table, a letter in front of her. It was folded neatly, the handwriting on the front unmistakable. Rob's heart skipped a beat as he walked toward her. He hadn't seen Nathan's handwriting in so long. Linda didn't say anything as he approached, but he could see the way her hands trembled slightly as she set the letter down. "He sent it," she said softly, her voice tinged with sadness. But there was something else there, something almost hopeful. Rob stared at the letter. It was a small piece of paper, but it carried with it so much. He knew what it meant. Nathan was reaching out, perhaps for the first time since everything had shattered. But Rob didn't move to open it. He didn't want to. Not yet. There was still too much unresolved. He sat down across from Linda, his hand resting on the table next to the letter. It felt too heavy, too final to just open without thought. "I'm sorry, Dad," Linda said quietly, the words barely a whisper. "He's trying, Rob. He really is." Rob looked at her then, seeing the quiet plea in her eyes. She was torn, still holding on to the hope that Nathan could change, that he could become the son she once knew. But Rob knew something she didn't. He knew that words weren't enough. That actions had to speak louder. He picked up the letter, holding it for a moment, before setting it down again. He couldn't open it, not yet, not until Nathan proved something, until he showed Rob that he understood what it meant to rebuild from the ground up, until he truly earned the right to be part of this family again. And so, the letter remained unopened, the future hanging in the balance between them, a quiet decision suspended in the air. What would Nathan do next? Would he rise to the challenge, or would he remain lost in the wake of his own mistakes? Only time would tell, but Rob wasn't rushing to find out. It was a quiet morning when Nathan showed up at the door. Rob was just finishing his coffee, his eyes still adjusting to the early light as the clock ticked steadily in the background. He wasn't expecting anyone, but there was something about the weight of the silence in the house that made him think someone might be just outside. When the knock came, Rob set the mug down and walked toward the door, his heart beating a little faster, unsure of what to expect. Standing in the doorway was Nathan. His face was drawn, his shoulders slightly hunched, as if carrying more than just the weight of a few months gone by. His clothes were simple, worn jeans, a faded jacket. He wasn't here to make a grand gesture, and Rob could tell right away. Nathan had come with no fanfare, no explanations, just a presence that was both familiar and foreign all at once. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Rob just stood there staring at him, trying to make sense of what was happening. Nathan's eyes were tired, but they held something else now, something Rob hadn't seen before. It wasn't arrogance, it wasn't entitlement, it was something quieter, more vulnerable. Regret? Or maybe just the weight of the reality he had been forced to face. Nathan cleared his throat, as if gathering the right words, but Rob beat him to it. "What are you doing here?" His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a guardedness that came from months of hurt. He had spent so long shutting everything out, focusing on moving forward. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected Nathan to show up and disrupt the fragile peace they had started to rebuild. Nathan hesitated, his gaze flicking downward for just a moment before he met Rob's eyes again. "I'm here to help," he said, his voice steady but low. "I know I don't deserve anything, but I want to make things right. I want to start doing something that matters." Rob didn't move at first. He stood there, his mind turning over the words, the implications. Nathan had said that same thing before, hadn't he? Hadn't he promised to make things right before? But something in Nathan's tone, something about the way he stood there looking so different from the man who had betrayed them, made Rob pause. Finally, Rob stepped aside. "Come in," he said simply. The air inside the house felt different now. The walls, once filled with so much history, were quieter, less filled with the noise of old arguments, old hopes. Rob had sold the old house, downsizing to something more manageable, a decision Linda had supported without hesitation. But it wasn't just the size of the house that had changed. It was the feeling inside it. They were starting over, together. Even if they had both been haunted by the ghosts of what had happened, they were moving forward, one step at a time. Nathan didn't waste any time. Without waiting for an invitation, he moved toward the cans of paint and brushes that sat waiting on the floor, as if he had done this 1,000 times before. He rolled up his sleeves, grabbed a brush, and started working. No words, just the steady rhythm of his movements as he applied paint to the walls, careful and deliberate. There was something strangely calming about it. The house didn't feel like it was in limbo anymore. There was something about the work, the act of restoring something with your own hands, that gave it new life. Linda walked in a few minutes later, her eyes catching the scene before her. She didn't say anything at first. She just stood there, watching the two of them, her face unreadable. Then she smiled, softly, almost shyly, as if she was afraid of the emotions rising in her chest. But Rob saw it, the way her eyes softened as she watched Nathan and him side by side, working together for the first time in what felt like forever. It was small, but it was everything. Rob stood back, watching the scene unfold before him. It wasn't just the physical act of painting that mattered. It was what it symbolized: trust, healing, a future, however uncertain, being rebuilt. Nathan was here, and that was enough, for now. After a long silence, Rob finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm. "This is the only way to rebuild trust," he said, his words carrying the weight of all they had been through. There was no bitterness in his voice anymore. There was no anger. There was just the truth, the work, the effort, the small, deliberate steps forward. That was how trust was earned. It couldn't be rushed. It couldn't be faked. It had to be rebuilt from the ground up. Nathan paused for a moment, his brush hovering midair. When he looked at Rob, there was no defensiveness in his eyes, no justification, just a quiet acknowledgement. "No shortcuts this time," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Rob nodded, his gaze softening for the first time in months. They didn't need to say anything more. The moment spoke for itself. Nathan had taken the first step. He had come back to do the hard work, not just with his hands, but with his heart. It was the first real move toward redemption. And in that silence, as the walls of the house grew brighter with each stroke of the brush, something shifted. Something unspoken passed between them. A mutual respect. A quiet understanding. They weren't where they needed to be yet, but maybe, just maybe, they were on their way. As they continued to paint, the air felt lighter, the burden that had weighed on Rob for so long beginning to lift. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many things left unsaid. But for now, they were here, together, working, and that was a start. The door was still open. The question that lingered in the air was simple. How far would Nathan go to rebuild what he had lost? But for now, Rob let the work speak louder than any words ever could. And as the paint dried, the future, though uncertain, felt just a little bit clearer. The house was smaller, quieter, nothing like the sprawling home they had once filled with laughter, arguments, and memories. But in its simplicity, there was peace. The small cottage sat on the edge of a lake, the water rippling gently against the shore as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard. The world here felt more grounded, more real than it had in months. Rob and Linda had spent weeks settling in, unpacking the remnants of their past, and slowly making this new place their own. It was a far cry from what they had once envisioned, but it was theirs. Linda was in the kitchen, her hands moving through familiar motions as she prepared dinner. The sounds of the quiet house, birds outside, the hum of the ceiling fan, felt like a lullaby. Rob sat at the small wooden table by the window, his eyes resting on the lake, the light fading into a soft dusk. It had taken time for the edges of the past to soften, for the bitterness to dissolve into something that could finally be called peace. They had been through so much: betrayal, loss, the relentless strain of rebuilding. But now they were here, and it felt like the weight of the world had finally lifted off their shoulders. The evening walks had become a ritual. They would walk along the lake, hand in hand, letting the cool breeze settle their minds, finding solace in the stillness that surrounded them. The first few walks had been quiet, the silence heavy with the things they hadn't spoken about. But with time, the rhythm of their steps began to match the rhythm of their lives, and slowly, the tension of the past faded. Now, As they strolled along the shore, the laughter between them was real again. Light, unburdened. It felt like something they had reclaimed, something that had been lost for far too long. Tonight, as they walked, Rob's hand brushed against Linda's, a silent affirmation that they had made it through. She smiled at him, her eyes reflecting the peace he had seen in her every day since they moved here. "It feels right," she said softly. "This place. It's quiet, Rob." He nodded, his gaze lingering on the horizon where the sun was beginning to dip below the trees. "It is. We've earned this." Later that evening, Gerald came by for a visit. The old friend had been there through it all, offering advice, guidance, and the occasional moral compass when Rob needed it most. He had been the one to suggest Rob take the legal route, to fight for what was rightfully his. They had both seen too many men like Nathan, too many people willing to take shortcuts, to destroy what was real just to get ahead. Gerald settled into the chair across from Rob, his usual easy smile on his face. "You handled it perfectly," he said, the words not just a compliment, but an acknowledgement of everything Rob had been through. Rob didn't smile back, but there was a quiet satisfaction in his expression. "Revenge wasn't the point," he said, his voice low but firm. "Balance was." Gerald nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Well, you've got it now," he said. "The scales are tipped back in your favor." Linda, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. "Now he knows who you are," she said, her voice carrying a softness that made Rob's chest tighten. She had lived through the worst of it, the years of Nathan's manipulation, the lies, the deceit. She had watched as everything they had built together nearly fell apart. But now, with the house sold, the ties severed, and Nathan's reputation in tatters, they had found a quiet peace that was more precious than any victory. Rob turned to her, his eyes meeting hers, and for the first time in a long time, there was no bitterness in his gaze, just understanding. "And maybe who he is," he added quietly. Linda's smile was soft, a knowing smile, one that spoke volumes without saying a word. She had seen it too, the way Nathan had crumbled under the weight of his own actions. The arrogance, the entitlement, all of it had fallen apart once he realized he couldn't manipulate his way to success. He had to work for it, just like everyone else. And maybe, just maybe, that would be the hardest lesson of all for him to learn. The room fell silent for a moment as the three of them sat there, the conversation drifting to other things, small talk, familiar ground. But for Rob, there was a quiet triumph in the air, something deep and satisfying. He had fought for what was his. He had fought to protect his family, to protect the things that truly mattered. And now they were here, safe, together. As Gerald stood to leave, he clapped Rob on the shoulder, his voice warm. "I'm glad you found your peace, Rob," he said, his eyes reflecting something more than just casual friendship. There was respect there, the kind of respect that comes from watching a man face down the worst and still come out standing. Rob didn't need to say anything more. He just nodded, his thoughts still lingering on the words they had shared. Peace wasn't something that could be bought. It was something you earned, through struggle, through sacrifice, through the courage to let go of what wasn't meant to be. As the door closed behind Gerald, Rob and Linda stood together at the window, watching the last remnants of the sunset fade into night. The sky was a deep purple now, the stars beginning to show themselves in the quiet of the evening. For the first time in a long time, Rob felt that the past was finally behind them. Whatever came next, whatever challenges awaited, they would face it together. There was no more doubt, no more anger, just the peace of knowing that for now, they had what they needed. But even as they stood there side by side, the question lingered in Rob's mind. What would Nathan do now? Would he find his way back, or would he stay lost? The future was still uncertain. The answer was still out of reach. But for tonight, at least, Rob allowed himself to believe that everything was finally as it should be. The dinner table was modest. There were no grand displays or extravagant dishes, just a simple spread, roast chicken, fresh vegetables, and a loaf of bread, the kind of meal that spoke of a new beginning, of simplicity after years of complications. The smell of home-cooked food filled the small, humble dining room, and the flicker of candles cast soft shadows on the walls, illuminating faces that had been through much. Nathan stood at the head of the table, his posture slightly awkward, as though this act alone, hosting this dinner, inviting his parents into his life once more, was still foreign to him. But there was a sense of quiet pride in his movements, an authenticity in his actions that hadn't been there before. He had made mistakes, too many to count, but tonight he wasn't hiding behind them. Tonight, he wasn't trying to win anything or prove anything. He was simply trying to make things right. Rob and Linda sat at the table, their faces softened by time and experience. They were no longer the people they had been when Nathan left. Too much had happened, too much had been broken, but they were here, together. And for the first time in a long while, there was a tentative peace between them. Nathan, though, was still nervous. His fingers fidgeted around the stem of his wine glass, and his eyes kept flicking toward his parents, wondering if they would accept the quiet gesture, the small attempt at healing that he had extended. He had never been one to ask for forgiveness. He had never needed to, until now. Rob's eyes, though tired, were steady as they watched Nathan. He could see the change, small but undeniable. Nathan wasn't the man he had been. And though Rob didn't know if this was enough, if the shift in his son was permanent, he knew one thing: Nathan was trying. Linda, sitting beside Rob, glanced at Nathan, her expression softening as he finally raised his glass. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't known what to expect, honestly. But as the quiet tension in the room lingered, she realized that, somehow, she had wanted this moment. She wanted to believe that there was a chance for Nathan, for them all. Nathan cleared his throat softly, his voice shaky but firm. "Two mistakes," he began, his eyes meeting his parents as they both looked at him. "And second chances." His gaze held Rob's for a moment longer than necessary, a silent plea wrapped in the simplicity of his words. There was a pause, a long, heavy pause, as Rob held Nathan's gaze, his fingers drumming softly on the table. Rob had never been one for speeches, but this moment was different. Nathan had changed, even if it was just a small piece of the man he had once been. Rob didn't need words to acknowledge it. He nodded, just a small, simple nod. He accepted the gesture. He accepted the attempt. Linda, sitting beside Rob, wiped her eyes quickly, the tears coming unbidden. The weight of it, the long road they had all traveled, pressed on her heart. She hadn't expected this either. She hadn't expected Nathan to show up like this, to offer something genuine. For so long, she had wished for a moment like this, but it had always seemed too far out of reach. And now, as Nathan stood there, as the quiet understanding settled between them, Linda could no longer hold back the tears. She reached for her napkin, dabbing at her eyes, her breath catching in her chest. Rob didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just placed his hand gently on hers, a quiet reassurance that it was okay. The years of disappointment, of hurt, of silence had finally led to this moment. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't enough to undo everything, but it was a start. Nathan's eyes softened as he saw his mother's tears. For the first time in so long, he felt the weight of what he had done. He had hurt her in ways he couldn't even comprehend before. But now, as he looked at her, fragile, yet still here, he realized just how much he had taken from her. He couldn't fix it, not all of it. But this small, simple meal, was his way of beginning to make amends. "I'm sorry," Nathan said quietly, his voice breaking the silence. "I know I can't undo what I've done, but I want to try. I want you both to know that." The words hung in the air, and though they weren't perfect, they felt like the truth. The room was still, but not in the tense way it had been before. It was still in the way that comes after all the noise has died down, when everything feels calm, as if the storm has finally passed. Rob and Linda looked at each other, sharing a silent moment of understanding. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, not entirely, but it was progress. It was the beginning of something that had seemed impossible just months ago. As the evening wore on, the conversation turned to lighter topics, small, easy things. Nathan asked about old family friends, about the neighborhood, about things that hadn't been discussed in years. There was no bitterness in the air now, no sharp words or resentful glances. Just simple, easy conversation, the kind that used to come so naturally. The kind that, for the first time in a long while, felt like it belonged. At the end of the night, as the plates were cleared and the laughter grew quieter, Rob stood up, the calm certainty returning to his voice. "I think we've made some progress tonight," he said, his words unforced. Nathan met his gaze, his face softer than it had been when he first walked in. "No shortcuts this time," he said, almost to himself, his voice low but sincere. Rob smiled slightly, nodding. "No shortcuts." For the first time in years, the laughter between them felt real. No walls, no pretenses, just the quiet, honest joy of family, flawed but intact. They had all been broken in different ways, but as they stood together in that simple room, there was a sense of peace settling in. A quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, they had finally found a way back to each other. But as Nathan lingered by the door, his hand resting on the frame, a question still lingered in Rob's mind. Had this really been enough? Could Nathan truly change? The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Rob allowed himself to hope. Rob sat in the dim light of the study, the weight of the decision pressing on him. The room felt heavier today, filled with the quiet rustling of papers and the sound of his own thoughts. He had always been a man who made decisions slowly, with purpose, but this was different. The pen in his hand seemed almost too light for the task before him, yet the words he was about to write felt like the heaviest he had ever put to paper. He looked at the will in front of him, the document that would define the future of his family, Linda's legacy, his legacy, their children's legacy. It was all tangled up in this. Years of work, of building something real, something worth leaving behind. Rob had always believed that legacy was about more than wealth or property. It was about who you were, what you stood for. And now, with everything that had happened, he had to make sure it was understood. The words were clear as he wrote them, each stroke deliberate. Both children shall share the inheritance, with the integrity clause included. He paused, his fingers hovering over the page. Integrity, the one thing that had been so severely lacking for the past year, the one thing that had cost him so much, that had nearly broken him. He wanted both of his children to have a chance at the future, but not at the cost of everything they had been taught. He couldn't let Nathan, no, not even Tracy, get away without learning the hardest lesson of all, the lesson that family wasn't a commodity. It wasn't something you could take for granted. He looked up at the wall, where a photo of Linda and him stood proudly beside their wedding picture. Their smiles frozen in time, a moment of happiness that now felt distant, almost out of reach. The laughter in the photo had long since faded, replaced by something more solemn, but there was still something real there, something worth fighting for. Rob could still feel the weight of it, the love they had built together, the life they had fought for. Rob folded the will carefully and slid it into the envelope. He didn't need to sign it yet. There was time for that. But for now, he knew what needed to be done. The house was quiet, as it always was now. The stillness was different than it had been months ago, when every room had been filled with the sound of Nathan's voice, of arguments, of plans made in the dark. Rob could almost feel the echoes of those days in the corners of the house, as if the walls had absorbed the tension. But today, the house felt peaceful. Empty, but peaceful. He had made the decisions he needed to make, and now there was nothing left but to wait. He stood up and walked to the window, his eyes drawn to the lake outside. The evening sun was just beginning to set, casting the water in shades of gold and amber. The view had always been beautiful, quiet, unassuming, but now it felt like something more. It felt like closure, like the world was finally beginning to settle after the storm. Rob opened the door to the porch and stepped outside, letting the cool air wash over him. The evening was calm, the air soft against his skin, the lake glowing with a warmth that only a sunset could bring. For a moment, he just stood there, letting the peace of the scene settle over him. The weight of the past months was still there, pressing on his chest, but it didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. Linda stepped out beside him, her presence a quiet comfort. She didn't say anything at first, just stood next to him, her hand brushing against his arm. They had been through so much together, too much, but this moment, felt like something they had earned together. "You came home early for a reason," Linda said, her voice soft but knowing. She hadn't needed to ask. She already understood. The decisions Rob had made in the last few days, the weight of everything that had happened, had finally brought them here, to this moment. "Yeah," Rob answered, his voice calm but carrying the weight of everything unsaid. "To make sure I never leave quietly again." He turned to look at her, his hand reaching for hers. Their fingers intertwined, the simple gesture of connection, grounding him in a way nothing else had in months. The sunset cast a golden glow on her face, and for the first time in a long while, Rob felt a sense of peace settle deep inside him. There was still work to be done, still a long road ahead, but for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a sense of finality. Not an end, but a new beginning. Linda smiled softly, her eyes searching his, as if asking the unspoken question. Would this be enough? Rob didn't answer. He didn't need to. He had done what he could. The rest was up to Nathan, and to time. As they stood there, watching the sunset, Rob felt a quiet triumph. It wasn't the kind of victory that came from winning a battle. It was the kind of victory that came from choosing peace, from reclaiming something broken and turning it into something worth holding on to. But even as the last of the sun dipped below the horizon, there was still the question of Nathan. Would he learn from this? Would he ever understand the lessons that Rob had tried to teach him? The future was still uncertain, but tonight, at least, Rob allowed himself the space to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was hope.